Many people ask me lots of questions about fences and boundaries, so as a result there are lots of frequently asked questions, lots of myths and lots of confusion. And that's what I'm talking about today. But first of all, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because if you've got questions of your own, I'm a barrister who helps you understand law. So let's start with the question as to whether or not there is a general obligation for you to fence in your land, garden or property. Now, it may surprise you to learn that there is no general obligation for somebody to fence in their land, although there are some circumstances where the law does require certain areas of land to be fenced in. These scenarios are usually to do with safety, such as railways, which in a very old law is the Railways Consolidation Act of 1845, disused mines, for example, under the Mines and Quarries Act of 1954, and around building sites that are next to the highway, and this is under the Highways Act of 1980. But what will be relevant to most of you is that in most covenant deeds or transfer deeds, there is a requirement on the purchaser and his successors to erect a fence around the land. This then leads into all sorts of questions as to who owns the fence, who is responsible for the fence, which way round the fence should go, whether somebody can be forced to repair or replace the fence, and all these sorts of questions. First of all, it is a very old myth that you own the fence on the left-hand side of your garden. Now, whilst this might very well be the case in lots of areas, this is usually decided when the land is originally split up by the developer and they draw on the plans who is responsible for which boundary. This is usually indicated by a T mark or some other mark which is denoted on those plans to tell the purchaser of that particular property or land which boundary they are responsible for. But there is no rule to say that this should be the left or the right, in fact. Some people believe also that a corner plot is responsible for all three. That is also not necessarily the case. You would need to look to the plans to see whether that is the case or not. And if there are no marks on the plans at all, it may not be a straightforward question to answer. Another old myth is that if your neighbour is responsible for a particular boundary, that they should put the good side of the fence or the smooth side of the fence facing you. This is another myth. There is no general law that requires that the neighbour does exactly that, and if that neighbour is responsible for that particular boundary, he or she can choose the colour and the style and the height of the fence within the height limitations, which I'll come back to. But there is no general obligation that the good side of the fence, as it were, is to face you. Other questions surround whether or not you can hang things on that fence if it belongs to your neighbour. The general position is no, because if that fence belongs to your neighbour, then you will need permission, because ultimately you will be causing at least some superficial damage to the fence by drilling a nail into it to hang something off it, like a plant, for example. So you will need permission if you wanted to do that. So word of warning here, if you do such things to what is ultimately your neighbour's property without permission, you may well be causing criminal damage to that fence. The same principle applies if you wanted to even paint or stain the fence. Even if you don't like the colour that it is, you would still need permission from your neighbour if you wanted to paint the fence. But of course, most neighbours are not going to object, but that's not to say every neighbour is going to be happy about you painting, even though it's facing your side and not theirs. So then we come on to the issue of heights of a fence and heights above which you may need planning permission. Now remember, planning rules can differ slightly around the country, so it is always best to check with your local council or a specialist in your particular area, and this generally applies across England and may differ in Wales. So with that said, the general position is that you would ordinarily not need planning permission to make a new fence, take down a fence, improve or repair a fence if the following things apply. If it is next to a highway used by vehicles or a footpath of such a highway, so long as the height of the fence from the ground level does not extend above 1 metre from ground level. And if the fence is anywhere else, that it doesn't extend above 2 metres from ground level. If there is already a fence in place which exceeds those limits, then so long as your work is not going to increase the height of that fence, then ordinarily you won't need planning permission for that either. And just whilst on the subject of planning permission, just a few headline warnings. If that fence is on the site of a listed building or within the curtilage of a listed building, then you are going to need planning permission for that. Equally, if it forms the boundary of any listed building site or within the curtilage of any listed building site boundary, then again you would be urged to seek planning permission first. Equally, in a conservation area, many of them have very particular rules, and there can be offences committed if you're doing anything in a conservation area which is against those rules or without permission. So as a general rule of thumb, anything within a conservation area, if it were me, I would be seeking permission before I do virtually anything. As for hedges, there is no general need for planning permission, again, so long as there is no planning condition or other covenants or restrictions. But again, if it were me in a conservation area, I would be checking the rules first. And even as a barrister, I would be checking with a specialist planning consultant that is dealing with these restrictions in such conservation areas, and I would be seeking that specialist advice before I do anything. When it comes to hedges, and particularly high hedges, they can often curtail the amount of light coming into a garden and adversely affect the amenity of your property. In other words, it can cast your garden into shadows and stop you from enjoying it. If you were to make a complaint to the council about such a thing, they would look to Part 8 of the Antisocial Behaviour Act of 2003. When the council looks at complaints under this legislation, they will look at the effect that this hedge has on your enjoyment of your garden and land. If the council forms the view that this hedge is simply far too high, casting your garden into shadows, stop you from enjoying your property, then the council can order the owner of that hedge to take action to put it right. This will usually entail cutting it down to a reasonable level to allow the light back into your garden. But I would urge you to speak to your neighbour politely first, because the council are not likely to look at your complaint unless you've taken reasonable steps first. But if you have a neighbour that simply won't talk to you or is simply outright refusing to do anything about the hedge, then you can take the complaint to the council. It's also important, particularly to save embarrassment, to determine that it is your neighbour that owns this hedge. To look for the owner of a hedge, or in fact anything that is growing out of the land, you look to the soil out of which this hedge is growing. If it transpires that this hedge is in fact on your side, which has happened and it does cause confusion on occasion, if the hedge belongs to you, then you are within your right to cut that hedge down, because the hedge belongs to you. But again, I would say that it is worth taking a little bit of advice just to ensure that someone else agrees with you that that is your hedge growing out of your land and you have the right to do so. Because again, if you cut the hedge down and it doesn't belong to you, then you are going to be responsible for that damage. If it's a single tree, however, then the council is not likely to get involved in this way unless it is 2 or more trees or 2 or more individual shrubs that are 2 or more meters above ground level. A single shrub or a single tree is not likely to qualify for this type of complaint. Instead, if there is a single tree that has grown very tall and overshadowing your garden, then so long as your property has received continuous light for 20 years or more, then you may well have a claim under the Right of Light Act of 1959. Again, you will need to seek specific advice for your circumstances because every situation is different. As for some more tips and information on overgrown hedges, overhanging branches and so on, see my other video linked in the description. In the meantime, leave me your questions and comments down below. Tell me about the situations you've had. They might make their way into new videos. Don't forget to check out my other stories on black belt secrets, and in the meantime, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.